Hey guys, so welcome back. We are continuing on with chapter 2 of The Sickness is a System When Capitalism Fails to Protect Us from Pandemics or Itself by Richard Wolff. I hope you guys enjoyed the last one. Remember, feel free to comment down below and let me know what your thoughts are or any criticisms or critiques of the channel and what I could do better. But other than that, let's go ahead and jump in. So mass unemployment is a policy choice. We are now in a depression, not a downturn or economic bump, having more or less than 30 million unemployed. People no one knows for sure is characteristic of a depression. Moreover, no one knows what's going to happen come election time. Predicting the future is like going to a carnival and taking the fortune teller seriously, rather than as a mute. The story being told by the folks in Congress about what's going on in this country is a desperate use of advertising to cover reality that is very different. True patriotism is the ability to face problems and recognize the faults in the system in order to overcome them. Celebrating America as the greatest economy in the world these days is nothing more than false advertising. Our politicians are very distant from the average person. They are mostly wealthy, white men. Demonstrating their disconnect, White House economic advisor Kevin Hassett recently referred to workers as human capital stock. This is a way to treat human beings as if they were interchangeable with other parts of the production process: tools, equipment, buildings, raw materials, and other inanimate objects. Capitalism makes it too painful for employers to recognize that employees are human beings. Firing 30 million of them means you're really hurting them. Their spouses, their children, their elderly who depend on them, their friends, their neighbors, and their relatives. It is easier, perhaps, to think of workers as a piece of furniture or machines as capital. But when employers dump people into months of unemployment while forcing them to stay inside and worry about the dangers of the coronavirus, it becomes catastrophic for all. Physical and mental health deteriorate, and you end up deteriorating your human capital stock by pretending that it's still standing there like a machine, waiting to be turned on again. Such a misunderstanding of the human experience is another one of capitalism's heavy costs. Our current mass unemployment was barely opposed, even by the Democratic Party, a party which quibbled with minor details of this reality. They wanted to be a bit more generous, with little checks given to people, and made some improvements in unemployment compensation. But basically neither the labor movement nor the Democrats in government organized a massive opposition. Massive unemployment was indeed a policy choice by both major parties. The truth is that unemployment in neoclassical economics is a mechanism for disciplining the working class. It's preferred by capitalists. Full employment has always been a term that conservatives and liberals have argued about. In 1946, a bill was passed that was originally called the Full Employment Act. Eventually, it was called the Employment Act. The name was changed during the negotiations in Congress. With President Roosevelt deceased, Congress began to whittle down the power of the New Deal. They didn't want the government to ensure full employment. So, the wording in the final bill was changed to maximum employment. But of course, the word maximum is vague. It is simply a loophole that allows for a certain amount of people to always be ready to be hired if a business wants them. The idea is that such a reserve army of unemployed workers will be desperately eager for a job. This way, employers can get them without having to raise their wages. The theory of the reserve army of the unemployed has been around for 200 years. It means that capitalism always maintains some form of unemployment because it's convenient to employers. If everybody is working, a business that wants to grow and hire more workers will have to look for them in another place where they're already working. To convince an employed worker to come work for you instead requires them to offer higher wages. Employers don't want that to be in that position. They like to have the convenience of having a perpetual pool of unemployed workers. A reserve army that employed does benefit employers in another way. Employed workers know if you don't accept what the employer dishes out, those unemployed people out there will take your job. Unemployed workers scare employed workers into being docile. The only time the United States ever got close to full employment, by which I mean 1% or less of the labor force out of work, was during World War II. In that case, we put half of the unemployed into uniforms and the other half into the making the uniforms and other military materials. We could give the unemployed useful jobs at any time, but it's only been warfare, when the country's survival is at stake, that capitalists allow the temporary disappearance of the reserve army of the unemployed. Today, we face a coronavirus pandemic and an economic depression. There are a variety of ways this can play out. One of them is that the economy bounces back quickly in the same 2 months or so that it took to hit it so far down. Another scenario is that it will take a good 6 months to a year for things to return to normal. Others believe it can take a decade or more, and there are those who believe it will never come back. There are good arguments for why those are the scenarios. The bottom line is that we don't know what the future holds. What is clear, however, is that President Trump is scared to death that he will be in a re-election campaign at a time when people are overwhelmed, or nearly so, by a virus that his government did not prepare for, did not know how to deal with, waited too long, and then did too little to address. That's going to haunt him. It is going to hurt him. On top of that, we had the second worst, or quite possibly the worst crash in U.S. capitalist history. He could potentially kiss his re-election goodbye. As a result, he is doing everything he can to reduce these two obstacles to re-election. He reduces the problem of the virus by pretending he's got it under control, when clearly he doesn't. He pretends there's testing going on when we know for sure that we haven't tested but 5% of our population. And he doesn't wear a mask in public to minimize and downplay the threat of the virus. The same goes for the economy. He wants to reopen the economy. That is a thin argument for basically saying he has to get people back to work because they're going to blame him for the extreme levels of unemployment. So, here he is pushing people who are desperate to return to our workplace, which in many cases, or perhaps in most cases, has not been made anywhere near adequately safe to return to. It is a very dangerous gamble by a very desperate politician. In our current crisis, the recently passed the Corona Aid Relief and Economic Security Act, the CARES Act, is a program invented by and for capitalists. It provides employers with money and it affords them with the discretion of how to use it. Of course, they use it to make profits for their company. Capitalists will lower wages and benefits, and if the workers don't like it, they will simply hire some of the reserve army of unemployed workers. The still employed, who are currently glad to escape unemployment, will soon be hit with the consequences of mass unemployment. Employers are even further empowered over their workers. That's what was accomplished here by a policy decision. This program, CARES, is supposed to fix a broken economy, but gives the people at the top even more money and even more leeway to use it in the same ways that brought us into this crisis in the first place. What is clear, more than ever, are the desperate levels of self-disillusion and the denial of the capitalist class. Onward. Why the neoliberal agenda is a failure at fighting coronavirus. The utter failure of private capitalism to prepare for the coronavirus should have surprised no one. Private capitalism, as business school graduates repeat, focuses on profit. The profit incentive, they learn, makes private capitalism the superior, most efficient economic system available. That is its bottom line and chief goal. The problem is that to produce adequate numbers of testing components, masks, gloves, ventilators, hospital beds, etc., and then to store, secure, monitor, maintain, and demographically stockpile them were not and are not privately profitable businesses. A private capitalist producer of those goods would have to wait, perhaps a long time, for them to become marketable. The risk is great, the future price unknowable, and profitable hard to count on. So private capitalists looked and found elsewhere to invest. They did not produce or stockpile the items needed to secure the public's health by preventing or minimizing a viral pandemic. Of course, private capitalism's failures could have been offset if governments compensated for them. Governments might have purchased the necessary medical supplies from private capitalists as they emerged from production at prices yielding them good profits. Governments could have them stored, monitored, replenished, and stockpiled them, and absorbed the costs and risks involved. Indeed, governments in many countries did that. but few maintain stockpiles sufficient for abnormal or serious viral threats. Most stockpiled only smaller, normal flu levels of the needed medical supplies. Ideas and practices of government compensating for private capitalism's failures and flaws are old. Business cycle downturns have brought repeated government economic interventions. They do so now. Another pertinent example is government intervention to procure military supplies. It is perfectly unprofitable to produce, store, secure, monitor, and strategically stockpile tanks, missiles, guns, airplanes, etc., needed for war or defense. Private capitalists would likely not produce or import them, given the risks and uncertainties of future military conflict. So, governments contract to buy them as they are produced at prices profitable for private producers of military supplies. Governments cover the costs and risks of storing, securing, and stockpiling. These immense government subsidies to private capitalists get justified as requirements of national security. What governments do to prepare for military security, they do not do, or inadequately, for health security from, for example, dangerous microbes. Yet viruses have threatened human beings at least as long as military conflict has. Many more Americans were killed by the 1918 influenza pandemic than died in the 1914-18 World War. Coronavirus has already killed many more Americans than did in the Vietnam War. Why then do governments compensate for private capitalism's failures and the military, but compensate so much less in the medical industries? And when governments do compensate in the latter, why so differently, varying from much in some countries to little almost nothing in others? Neoliberalism's ideological power, varying from country to country, provides an answer. Where it is strong, governments minimize economic interventions. They cultivate blindness to prepare private capitalism's failures and often simply deny them. Officials thus cannot publicly and explicitly undertake to compensate for failures in, say, the private medical industries. Trump expressed his neoliberalism by dissolving Obama's White House Pandemic Preparedness Organization. Neoliberalism argues for laissez-faire. Private enterprises left alone to produce and market without governmental taxation, regulation, etc., will outperform systems where governments intervene. Neoliberalism celebrates the private over the governmental nearly everywhere. It is a kind of fundamentalism in economics. God is private, while the devil is government. The exceptions, the military, police, and judiciary prove the rule. All other social institutions must be private to work best. Markets, like enterprises, should be free, i.e., not subject to government. Neoliberal politicians decline to organize, endorse, or support governmental production, import, storage, securing, or stockpiling of virtually anything that private capitalists are or could be doing instead. Private profit, not bureaucratic flight, should be the guiding goal of the production and distribution of all goods and services, more or less expecting military, police, and judiciary. Libertarianism is a more extreme version of neoliberalism. Where neoliberalism is strong, governmental preparations for and copings with coronavirus were weak, too late, and too little. As in the US, the UK, and Italy, among others, and societies where neoliberalism is relatively weak, government is accorded considerable respect and deference. Its antiviral initiatives and policies, including economic interventions, were welcomed, or at least expected, to play positive roles. Examples include China, South Korea, and New Zealand, among others. Where neoliberalism is weak, government economic interventions can receive ad hoc criticisms and oppositions, but they are not opposed in principle. Where neoliberalism is strong, opponents define government as always and necessarily an inefficient intruder into what private enterprise, if left alone, would do better. Neoliberalism is a preferred ideology of private capitalist employers. This special interest, a very small minority, embraces neoliberalism in self-interest. Its neoliberalism proclaims private capitalists' utter superiority to any other social group that threatens or might threaten its economic dominance. It thus exorciates labor unions and government bureaucracies, and sometimes the monopolization of big businesses for interfering and distorting free markets. Neoliberalism views some government economic interventions as distorting intrusions into private capitalism. It views others as comprising an evil alternative to private capitalism. The label socialism serves neoliberals nicely to capture both horrors. On the one hand, it designates government meddling and free market capitalism, and on the other, it signifies government-owned and operated enterprises and government-planned distribution of resources and products. As private capitalism's chief theoretical champion, neoliberalism seeks to vanquish the enemy, theories of Marx and Keynes. Whatever we think of the theoretical jousting, coronavirus has sharply clarified neoliberalism's profound social costs. Millions are sick, and many thousands dead because of government's delayed and inadequate compensations for private capitalism's failures to prepare for or cope with the virus. Dangerous viruses have attacked human society many times throughout history, preparing for the next attack, thereby securing public health, has long been a basic duty of all social systems. Feudalism failed in that duty when many millions of Europeans succumbed to the Black Death in the 14th century. That failure weakened European feudalism. Capitalism is failing in that duty now with coronavirus, in part because of neoliberalism. As that lesson sinks in to contemporary consciousness, major challenges confront and will likely also weaken both neoliberalism and capitalism. Furthermore, the US prepares for war, not for COVID-19. I would like to compare how the United States handled the COVID-19 pandemic and how the United States handles military preparedness and military activity. There's more to be learned from this comparison than you might imagine. Here's the problem. Very simply, viruses are an old, well-understood problem. They have attacked human beings for as long as there's been a species called human beings. What you need to handle them is the testing to see who's got it and who doesn't. And you need the equipment and the arrangements to prevent people from infecting one another. So, in order to have the public health protected, you need to have a proper stock of tests, masks, gloves, ventilators, hospital beds, the whole business of managing a virus when it attacks. Private companies cannot afford to produce huge quantities of these, to stockpile them around the country so they will be available to serve the populations that will need them. There is too much risk and too little profit in handling medical supplies in warehouses for months or years until they are purchased to deal with a virus, so private capitalist companies don't do that. Now here's the parallel with defense spending. The same thing applies to guns, bullets, missiles, tanks, and aircraft, and all the rest of the military equipment. It doesn't pay for a company to produce private jets. For example, stockpile them in hangars around the United States and wait for the next foreign crisis. When the military comes to buy such equipment, that's too risky. Private capitalists may have to wait a long time, so they find less risky and more profitable opportunities. If you leave capitalism to itself, to its private enterprises driven by profit, you will not get the production and stockpiling of the needed equipment to combat a virus, and you will not get the production and stockpiling of the military equipment to fight wars. Now, let's see how these two problems have been resolved, or not, in the United States. Let's start with defense. The government doesn't say so, but here's what's going on. The government came and solved the problem. It isn't profitable for private firms to produce guns, missiles, and tanks, so the government comes in and makes it profitable for them. The government agrees to purchase the goods as fast as they are produced, to take the risk unto itself. The government stockpiles these weapons around the country, indeed around the world, and maintains them at its own expense. If they go out of date because new weapons are developed, the government scraps the old and buys the new. The government promises private enterprises that will make a lot of money because they will pay well for this military equipment. And so we have guns, planes, missiles, and tanks stockpiled all over the place. Now, compare this to our medical preparation. Nothing. The government didn't do it. The government didn't do in the medical field what it did in the military field. It didn't buy and stockpile and testing equipment or the components of tests. It didn't stockpile and buy masks, ventilators, hospital beds, ICUs, and all the rest of what we need. So, there wasn't any. The government didn't come in and admit that private capitalism can't and won't do it and take the responsibility. So the question becomes, what happened here? Don't we need to be protected from a virus? At least as much as we need to be protected from some military activity directed against the United States. Of course we do. But the government didn't act. Didn't do for the medical field, and what it does regularly for the defense field. And why not? And the answer is the medical industries don't want it. The medical industries can make more money doing other things. More importantly, they don't like the image of the government making up for the failure of private capitalist enterprises to do what public health demands. The very image that we need the government to secure public health because private enterprises and capitalism can't or won't do it is a problem that they don't want to see underscore in our society at all. The government didn't act in the medical area the way it does in the military to serve the private medical establishment, the doctors, the hospitals, the drug and device makers, and the medical insurance companies. Those four industries acting together made sure, as they always have, that the government is kept out of medicine. They always denounce government intervention and medical care as socialism. Lots of their money have been spent buying lots of politicians. So the United States doesn't get that kind of medical system that every other advanced country, industrial country has. Despite that, we in America end up paying more for medical care than anywhere else in the world. We have a medical system limited and constrained by private capitalism that dominates and does not permit the government to do for medical preparedness what it does for military preparedness. Is it crazy to have a system like this? You bet. And the conclusions to be drawn from this, I will leave to you. Continue. Why government mostly helps people who need it the least, even during a crisis. In January 2020, the NASDAQ Stocks Market Index stood just under 10,000, and the March crash, it fell to 7,000. As of July 10, 2020, it hit 10,600. The U.S. government's economic policies produced a recovery for the rich, who own the vast bulk of stocks. Their holdings are worth more now than before COVID-19 hit us. The other major benchmarks for securities, the Dow Jones Industrial Average and the Standard & Poor's 500, show similarly dramatic, slightly smaller recoveries. Massive government economic intervention, when most of its current beneficiaries have always denounced, subsidized those recoveries. The Federal Reserve pumped unprecedented amounts of money into the U.S. economy after mid-March. That money poured into the stock market and fueled its rise. The U.S. Treasury provides unprecedented direct cash supports to much of corporate America. Over the same time, government economic support for the working class was too little, too late, and totally inadequate to what could and should have been done. And their unequal impacts. Government economic policies were cruel and unjust. In this, they resemble government public health policies. With under 5% of the world's population, the United States accounts for about 25% of COVID-19 cases and about 24% of COVID-19 deaths globally. All but the most ideologically blinded and government supporters know what such a statistic means. I focus here on how the government's economic policies affected corporations versus employees. The rich versus the middle class and the poor. Direct government support sustained most corporations. Bigger and richer corporations hire more and better. Lobbyists make larger actual or potential donations to politicians and parties, and so on. They thus got big portions of government help. And generally, the pandemic can crush her medium and small businesses more than big ones, while the latter got disproportionate government help. Government policies likely worsened the relative decline, and small and medium businesses. Concentration and monopolization tendencies within U.S. capitalism strengthened. The U.S. government's monetary policies, executed by the Federal Reserve, undertook to rescue the stock market as priority number one. The Fed pumped in massive amounts of money via very low interest rate loans to banks and by directly buying corporate debt and U.S. government debt. In a collapsed economy with tens of millions of unemployed, little of that new money flowed into productive investments, rehiring workers, or enterprise expansions. Those did not offer attractive profits. Instead, the new money went where profits could still be made, the stock market. Hence, they recovered. Banks, corporations, and the rich used most of the new money to buy stocks from one another. That drove up stock prices. Each purchased by one Fed beneficiary was later sold to another Fed beneficiary at a higher price. Such capitalist gains encourage repetitions, or stock flipping, rather like real estate hustlers, house flipping, before the 2008 mortgage collapse crisis. As this stock market bubble continues to build, anxiety about eventual bursting rises. Recoveries for corporations and the rich were not matched by what government policies achieved. For most employees, the differences were stark. Employers fired more than 40 million employees who were thus forced to file for unemployment benefits. The government did not rehire those millions to undertake COVID-19 testing of the U.S. population, a Green New Deal for infrastructure, etc. The unemployed faced mounting difficulties in meeting their financial obligations. Neither GOP nor Democratic leaders generated anything like that as set government programs that saved the working class from greater catastrophe. During the 1930s Great Depression, then FDR's New Deal, including establishing Social Security to provide monthly checks for all over 65, federal unemployment insurance, a minimum wage, and a federal jobs program that employed many millions of those fired by private employers. It wasn't just incomes that were lost, but the millions who have been unemployed since March. Losses far above the $1,200 checks given, many and the extra $600 per week for the insured employed. No guarantee was provided that their old jobs would be available to them again, or that their eventual wages and benefits would be what they were before COVID-19. When will their unemployment insurance fall or end? And they refuse to return to unsafe workplaces, given that most Americans still have not been tested for COVID-19. Would they lose jobs and eligibility for unemployment insurance? Excruciating anxiety, added to the other sufferings of being unemployed in pandemic America. Many millions of unemployed now face near certainty that their former jobs are forever gone. They have thus lost the seniority, work relationships, connections, skills, and links to home, community children's schools, etc., that those jobs entailed. Those who kept their jobs so far are nevertheless also threatened by today's mass unemployment. Employers can now confront their employees with wage and/or benefit reductions and other deteriorations of worker conditions. If employees refuse, they risk getting fired and replaced by the increasingly desperate unemployed. Since employees know that most knuckle under, recent U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics reports confirm that wages are declining, with further declines widely predicted. Others who kept jobs and incomes that performed them from home encountered all sorts of new difficulties and expenses. For example, full-time air conditioning for stay-at-home workers and their children added hundreds of dollars to the millions of affected workers' monthly utility bills. Social movements across the country, Black Lives Matter, activism against intervention and for rent moratoria, strikes and job actions for COVID-19 safe work conditions, calls for debt relief, etc., all attest to serious suffering and growing pushback. Those movements represent the other side of the recovery celebrations among corporations and the rich and the politicians and the media they own. Rising stock markets and corporate bailouts. The recoveries enable the already richest to become richer still. Jeff Bezos, the CEO of Amazon, added $24 billion to his already more than $100 billion personal wealth. Meanwhile, the U.S. working class remains far, far from any comparable recovery. Inequality in the United States deepens yet again. Lest I be misunderstood or confused with the libertarians, I do not attach responsibility for government policies propelled to politicians and bureaucrats. The government mostly does what its constituents with money and power make it do. In U.S. capitalism, most of the money and power are concentrated in a small minority. The corporate rich and their closest subordinates and allies occupy Wall Street, refer to them as the 1%. Their interest to prevail in government policies unless and until genuinely countervailing power emerges from organized mass of employees. Our big problem is not the government, but the concentrated wealth and power that drives it and controls it. All right, guys, I'm going to leave it off here. I hope to finish chapter 2 tomorrow or sometime next week. Thank you guys for watching. And like I said, feel free to comment below. And hope you guys have a great night.